Welcome to the Broadband. Oh, recording in progress. Welcome to the Broadband Technical Assistance webinar series. This is session 2 of our series. It's about laying the foundation. It's an introduction to broadband, infrastructure, access, and adoption grants. We'll go ahead and start with intros. My name is Lucas Lemonds. I'm an American Connection Corps member serving with Generation West Virginia this year. We also have Annie Stroud, who is our Generation West Virginia Broadband Director, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her to get us started.
All right, thanks so much, Lucas. Well, hi, everybody. Great to see you all. Always fun to see who puffs on here today. Like Lucas said, I'm the Broadband Program Director for Generation West Virginia. If you aren't familiar, Generation West Virginia is a statewide nonprofit that works to equip young West Virginians with key skills and career opportunities, ensuring their ability to thrive in the Mountain State. We've got 4 main programs. We have our Career Connector, which includes a job board, resume bank. We've got a program called the Generational Talent Search that helps connect folks with specific career opportunities. We have our fellowship. This is one I think most folks have probably heard the most about. It's a really great professional development opportunity for young folks in the state. We'll mention this again later, but applications are currently open. That goes in March for that program. We have New Force, which has been a software training program, but this year we've actually transitioned over to data analytics based on some feedback from employers and folks through the program. So that first cohort in our data analytics program is running now, but it's a program that takes folks from, entry, no experience, and takes them through all of the programming languages and pieces of information they need for that. I'm not a data analyst, so that was probably not any of the right words for that. And then broadband, which really kind of came about responding to needs identified by folks all across the state where without that kind of good broadband connection, how can we have remote work? How can we access the education needed and the careers in some of our most rural environments? So I'll talk more about that in a second. Go to the next page, please. So why broadband? Quick overview. West Virginia is very low in the rankings as far as broadband access in the state. I believe we're 50th or 49th nationwide. Almost 30% of households lack a strong fixed broadband availability. So that means a wired line over 100 download, 20 upload. And then we also have a lot of challenges around digital equity, which is the next piece of that, which is once we have broadband access, how do people actually utilize and take advantage of that resource? Based on some recent stats from the American Community Survey, up to 19% of our total population reports not using the internet at all, and 36% report not using a PC or a tablet. So the use that they do have at all is all mobile, which I think speaks to the lack of awareness of the devices, affordability challenges, as well as the baseline broadband access piece as well. Next page. All right, so Generation West Virginia broadband. So what are we doing? So we help overcome barriers to broadband access by trying to fill in capacity gaps and being a connector across private, public, nonprofit sectors. We kind of have 2 big pots and areas that we work that are very interrelated, but we do kind of similar stuff. So for infrastructure, we've been working on this for the longest. We started with this really in 2020, really focused on this kind of wraparound technical assistance model. So working with communities, regional planning, councils, communities that are looking at actual broadband deployment projects. So laying the fiber, figuring out how to get households connected to the internet. A lot of this work really was successful because of the ability to develop partnerships, and kind of cross-pollinate folks around the deployment piece. This was a very successful program. We've been able to secure over $45 million in state and federal funds to support new fiber construction for over 30,000 homes across West Virginia, which is very exciting. We started there, and then along came the Broadband and Infrastructure Act, which we're really excited about. West Virginia was allocated $1.2 billion for that, but definitely kind of started shining the spotlight on that next piece. So here's the access component, but the other part is how do we actually make sure people are able to access, use, and adopt that broadband service once it's actually built out to their locations. So what we do around that is we've done some research and planning. We worked with 18 counties last year through an Appalachian Regional Commission Arise grant with Connect Humanity to develop county level digital equity plans, digging into the barriers, the needs, and some of the localized community goals. We are able to offer wraparound technical assistance for these types of projects as well. So everything from grant writing, subject expertise, project development, etc. And then we're also, continuing to work with communities that we worked with for county level digital equity plans, but really looking at, how do we continue doing peer learning? Can we put together workshops, webinars like this, and keep working with our local steering committees to make sure that we're all learning and from each other and being able to take advantage of kind of best practices of organizations across the nation, because we're pretty new to it here in West Virginia, but a lot of this stuff has been happening nationwide for a long time. So that's a quick overview of what we do. Yeah, 100% Cal. I just saw your chat. The percentage of folks without reliable access is still really, really high for the state. We're working on it, but still there. I'm going to go ahead and hand this back over to Lucas now, and he's going to talk a little bit about some example projects. What are we talking about when we talk about broadband access projects? What do these look like before we kind of start walking through what some of the specific types of grants are? So Lucas, go ahead.
Okay, so to start off, what broadband access may mean if you don't understand what that means, it covers all the barriers to broadband access from the infrastructure side all the way to the digital equity side. So here's some examples of some broadband access projects. On the infrastructure side, we do have planning grants, broadband networks such as hanging the fiber, the fixed wireless. There's non-traditional solutions such as community-owned / municipal networks. There's mobile access points. You could do public access grants, which is public Wi-Fi. You could also do facilities, network upgrades, telemedicine, and telehealth projects as well. And then you have the educational facilities side and then the emergency management side. And this is just on the infrastructure side. When it comes to digital equity and adoption, you could also do planning grants such as digital equity plans or digital opportunity plans. You could do digital literacy / skills trainings, workforce trainings. You could do cybersecurity / online safety trainings as well. Digital navigators. So that's kind of my role as I serve as a digital navigator. So this could be teaching digital skills, helping people learn how to access telemedicine services, how to use public services such as the DMV, schools, etc., but also local tech support on how to use technology if they're not as familiar with that. Device distribution is another form. So this is sourcing affordable devices to people, these devices that would meet the need of the users, so that accessibility part of it. Affordability programs to afford the broadband and to be able to afford the devices and the technology that they need is important. And then public access grants back into that public Wi-Fi. So that's kind of just a general overview of what some of these projects could look like. So now I'm
Pop
going to go over.
in.
Oh,
I said I will pop in real quick to say too, I think one of the things that I like to know when we're thinking about these kinds of projects is there's a lot of interconnection between them, right? So you may have deployment projects that really rely on those follow-up digital skills, workforce training. You might have programs that are really trying to increase access to telemedicine or increase access to certain educational pieces that wouldn't be possible without that more infrastructure network upgrade facility side of it. So these are both distinct in that the funding sources are sometimes pretty clear which one they can find, but oftentimes you can weave aspects of both of these into projects when you're putting them together.
All right, so now I'm going to go into some specific broadband access grants that are out right now. The first one is the AARP Community Challenge Grant Program. So a special note about this, these are due on March 6th. So it is quite a quick turnaround if you haven't already been working on these. It is administered by the AARP. And the purpose of this grant program is to support community projects to improve livability for all residents of all ages, such as broadband access, different impacts it could have. It can provide short-term funding for digital inclusion efforts. It can support public Wi-Fi initiatives and digital literacy trainings. It can help the communities implement small-scale projects for broadband infrastructure improvements in their area. And overall, it's good for small targeted projects, such as impacts for 50 plus population or learning, device access, and medical access in many different areas. And this one's more centered on the digital literacy and the digital skills area. It's not as much on the broadband side, whereas the USDA Connect Humanity grant project, that's administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Rural Development. This one's more focused on the broadband side. So it provides financial assistance to construct these broadband networks that offer service on a community oriented connectivity basis in rural areas that lack that existing broadband. The eligibility for this grant, the USDA Community Connect grant, is you must propose to provide broadband service to a rural area that lacks the existing broadband service, but also fostering that economic growth in there and also making sure to deliver enhanced educational, healthcare, and public safety benefits with the broadband expansion as well. Overall, we would say this one's good for an infrastructure project that's focused on community facilities, and it's good for rural and very rural areas. And so there's a digital literacy one, and then there's also a broadband one as well. And those two are currently open. One, it just has a tighter deadline than the other, and that's the AARP one. Other broadband access grants, so the ARC Power Grant, this is administered by the Appalachian Region Commission. So what this does, it expands broadband access in coal impacted areas to support economic diversification. So the impact of this specific grant, it could fund broadband deployment for workforce training, healthcare access, and small business growth. It could also support public-private partnerships to improve connectivity in some of these distressed areas throughout the state. It prioritizes fiber optic and fixed wireless solutions, which will help close the digital divide in the future, hopefully. Overall, this project is good for projects that have a tie to economic development connections, such as workforce development, small businesses, support for coal impacted communities, and many other things. So this one can be broadband and digital equity grant. So it's kind of a more broad one. So it's good for both of those projects. Another one we have is the USDA Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant. This is also a tight deadline. It is due March 6th as well. So it's going to be hard to get that together if you haven't already started. It's administered by the USDA Royal Utility Service. The purpose of this grant is to fund broadband-enabled distance learning and telemedicine projects in rural areas. Some impacts this grant could have, it could provide grants to rural schools, libraries, and healthcare providers. It could also support telemedicine infrastructure for hospitals and clinics in the state. It could also enhance remote learning platforms and virtual job trainings. Overall, this grant is good for rural projects with clear equipment slash networking needs, and it's more tailored for telehealth and distance learning. And then some digital opportunity grants that we have out there. So the state capacity digital opportunity grants, these are expected to be coming out within the next couple months. The first one is the Digital Skills Grant. This supports digital literacy training and workforce development programs. It was originally supposed to open up this month, but it might be more towards the end of this month, beginning of March. But once that application window opens, you do have 60 days to apply for it. So that first digital skills grant is more for digital literacy trainings and workforce development programs. Whereas the next one that'll come out following is the device distribution grant. So this grant will fund the purchase and distribution of digital devices to underserved communities. It's expected to open up in March or April. And then once again, it'll have a 60-day window for applications to go in. And then the third part of this state capacity grant is local digital equity planning grant. So what this one does, it assists communities in developing those digital inclusion strategies and what ways they can implement digital equity strategies into their communities. This one's expected to open up in April or May. Once again, you'll have a 60-day time window for this one as well. There are other funding sources such as workforce development grants. There is telehealth grants slash telemedicine grants, housing funds, the Royal Health Funding Network. There's many different forms that you guys can use to support this type of programming as well. And I think that's on my part, so I'm going to hand it over to Annie to do the next part and to recap on anything I may have missed.
That's great, Lucas. Thanks. Another note is we will be digging into more about how to find the exact right grant and how to kind of find the one that's most appropriate for your projects next month. We'll actually have WVU Grant Resource Centers on to talk a little bit more about that. So I'm actually going to talk through a few, broader general eligibility criteria and kind of best practices for these kinds of grants. For the rest of today. So, generally who can apply, depending on the funding source, sometimes providers, again, obviously for deployment grants, they're usually eligible, but sometimes for some of these other ones as well. Local state governments, nonprofits and cooperatives, educational institutions, and then private partnerships. And as well. Typically, it's helpful to have your main organization be kind of identified, but a lot of these grants do really benefit from bringing in multiple partners. Things in general to keep in mind. Some of these grants do require matching funds, some don't. A lot of federal grants typically do. The state grants this year will not. It just really depends on your funding source, but it's important to keep that in mind and make sure that it's clear. Obviously, each different funding source, whether it's a grant, a foundational opportunity, has to comply with whatever guidelines they have, whether it's federal and state, whether they have their own guidelines they're looking at. And you also want to think about the way to frame the project that you're doing. Again, a digital skills training course, for instance, could be targeted towards, maybe a senior population looking at increasing their online safety and access to telehealth. You could probably take the same course and frame it as a workforce development program, helping young people get the baseline digital skills needed to enter the workforce. So thinking about the framing around the prioritization for the funding sources you're looking at, as well as, the kind of targeted populations that you're trying to reach. Other pieces to think about, for deployment ones especially, you really are looking at typically expanding access in places that are listed as unserved or underserved. Right now, West Virginia is in kind of a funny spot in that our BEAD allocation, in theory, is covering all of the addresses that are listed as unserved or underserved. We'll see here in a few years, the state was using a version of all of those addresses from 2022. So my guess is we are still going to have some addresses that are not covered by the BEAD allocation that require some additional work. But every day we're waiting for the final proposal on that one. So we'll have more information on that hopefully soon. Other things to think about, obviously, if you're doing any sort of construction project, and you're getting federal or state funds, you're going to have to comply with whatever permitting, environmental, regulatory standards are there. So just keep that in mind. And then oftentimes, again, whether it's a deployment project or a skill training program, those kinds of things, there is going to be a need to explain the sustainability of your program. A lot of folks are not looking to fund we'll run this program for 1 year and that's it. They want to hear what the plans are to make sure that those projects are moving forward. This is also a really good place to think about those other partnerships in your community that could potentially affect your program. Because oftentimes I think building those interrelated partnerships can be good ways to help ensure the sustainability because you're spreading out the work a little bit and spreading out your funding for some of the same programs. And the other piece too, which I feel like should be obvious but isn't always, is anytime you're dealing with grant funds, again, whether it's state, federal, or foundation, there is usually going to be a monitoring or reporting piece. So make sure that your organization understands what reports you're going to be required to do ahead of time. So it's not a shock, quarter in and they ask for your update and you haven't collected any data. Just making sure that you have the systems in place to actually effectively monitor and report on all the great work that folks are doing. Excuse me. All right, so, again, a lot of this is probably sort of obvious, but I just really like to mention it again because I think thinking through these steps can sometimes be really helpful in putting together projects. So best practices for infrastructure projects, you could take all of these and say for any grant project really, is again your clear planning and feasibility. If you are looking at a project that is looking at serving specific addresses, you have to know where exactly they are, how many there are, and have a plan for how to reach them. Again, you really want those partnerships. Work with your local government, reach out to your local providers and community organizations, especially your regional planning councils and providers right now too. I've been talking about broadband for a long time. There's been a lot of work done across the state. There's been some studies. This is a screenshot from the Regional Optical Communications statewide study that they did a few years ago. So if you have an idea and kind of want to see what's happened already, reaching out and starting those conversations and building those relationships is a really, really critical first step. Again, looking at diverse funding sources. If you're looking for a project to get started, if you're looking at federal or state funds that do require a match, you usually cannot use other federal funds as match for that. So you automatically need a diverse funding source. But it's also a good plan just in terms of sustainability. Sometimes we see funding sources disappear, especially if you're looking at federal funds right now. There's a lot of questions about what's out there. So looking at alternative ways to fund your project, to sustain your project, and ensure that your model is going to be sustainable and able to continue. Future-proofing your technology and the kind of scalability. There's been a lot of discussion about different technologies, but looking into the future, the amount of data that people are transmitting online grows exponentially every year with more and more services integrating AI and some of these other kind of data-heavy services, the increase in streaming subscriptions and these kinds of things mean that there are some technologies that technically can meet our definition of broadband, which is 100 over 20 right now. But anticipating the further growth, both for business development, education, folks at home, thinking about the technology that you're using and how to scale those and how those networks will actually be sustainable in the long run are going to be important. And some funding sources are trying to prioritize because they're recognizing that these things are changing and they don't want to spend millions of dollars to build something that is going to be obsolete here in 2 or 3 years because there'll be other options. That said, there are also going to be locations where building a fiber line 10 miles up a road to reach one house isn't going to be a feasible option. So maybe we do need to look at some of these alternative technologies and ways to get creative to reach those really, truly last mile locations across the state. And then again, just making sure you've got that compliance piece down, you have ways to monitor, you have transparent reporting, and set those expectations with anyone that you're working with right from the top. Next page. So here are two kind of interesting non-traditional examples. Just to share of, one of them was this American Electric Power and Gigabeam Broadband project. This one, a lot of folks are really excited about. It's happened in other states. Unfortunately, AEP's kind of drawn back from continuing this model, but it was this really interesting model where the power company worked directly with a provider to work together to build the middle mile fiber because this benefited power company. They were getting fiber lines built out to their substations where they needed to monitor anyways. And we were also able to work with a provider to work to connect folks along the way with high-speed internet. So it was a really interesting idea. I would love to see more of this kind of development in various places and has happened successfully in other spots if you have a utility that's able and willing to invest in that. Another one, this is another kind of non-traditional example where actually Woodlands Development Group in based out of Elkins got two different grants. They got an ARC grant and an EDA grant to build fiber up an area that was previously unserved. They were able to build in some pieces like free services for certain community facilities along the way. And that project took a little bit to get moving, but is underway and was an interesting one of the only kind of examples of these more like organizational owned, where they're actually partnering with the ISP, not as the owner of the network. Woodlands is going to hold the ownership of it, but they're going to operate the network. Again, there's other examples about this in other parts of the world in West Virginia. We haven't seen a whole lot of these kinds of projects. A lot of the projects funded are where the providers themselves have been able to directly apply to the state to get the funding to expand their networks. Next one. All right, so some best practices for digital inclusion or digital equity projects. The first is identify your local needs. You know, we have a really good idea of the local needs when it comes to broadband access and deployment because there are addresses and they either have service or they don't. But when it comes to identifying the biggest gaps on the local level, there is a little bit of a different planning process that needs to happen because depending on where you are, you might find that your biggest local need maybe isn't skills, maybe it's lack of transportation, or it's one of these a different barrier that we haven't, necessarily been addressing through some of these other programs because, when it comes to accessing and affording broadband, having the skills, having the devices to use it, all of those pieces, there's a whole range of barriers that face different populations that really vary by those kind of local conditions on the ground. So identifying your local needs is really critical. Looking at your underserved population, so who in your community may have additional barriers to access. Are there any factors that mean that certain populations have a greater barrier to access, whether that's your low-income population, maybe it's seniors in the community, those that are most rural, things like that. The other piece that's really critical for this kind of work is identifying your local assets. So who is there already? The strongest projects and the most sustainable projects are usually built on existing relationships, existing organizations, folks that are already in the community that have trust, they have a reputation, and sometimes adding capacity to those organizations or partnering with them can be a really good way to build a project that will be able to thrive beyond, again, a one-time funding source or something like that. So a lot of people are doing work already that could be described as digital equity work. They might not know to call it that. Your librarians, for instance, I guarantee any library with a computer is doing digital equity work because someone comes in and needs help and they're there to help them. But also organizations like your family resource networks, your senior centers, sometimes food banks, even you have people coming in asking how to get hooked up to their benefits. Banks, lots of the healthcare systems, all of these partners in our communities, even our most rural communities usually are probably already reaching people or having folks that have identified this need that could be a great partner to build a project with. Leverage strategic partnerships. So again, this is where, you can think about not just who's touching the folks that you want to work with, who already has a relationship with them, but who else in the community that maybe isn't plugged into those folks would be helpful and would see a need. I think about local governments, local EDAs, for instance. Again, going back to that digital skills example, it's critical for parents and seniors and veterans to know how to use the internet so they can set up appointments and check on their kids and all of these pieces. But the other piece that directly ties into a lot of our goals, especially for economic development and workforce development in the state, are: do we have an educated workforce? Does the workforce have the resources they need? Are they healthy? All of these pieces can tie directly into that. Do the businesses in our community have the access that they need? Do they know how to use all these online resources? Are they keeping their businesses safe? So thinking about pulling in, again, those maybe more like government, nonprofit, EDA partners, but the business community that all have a very strong incentive and a strong reason for their local population to be digitally literate and to have access, whether it's, again, for that economic piece or for them to use their services. So don't forget about them. Again, focus on sustainability. I know I keep saying that, but it is really important, especially when we have these periods of more uncertainty around funding streams. But thinking about, how do we fund this? If you're adding services, if you're adding a staff person, are you able to find ways to bring funding for that so that it doesn't just disappear when your grant dries up? Because there's a lot of examples of that, of course, all across the country, of course, where you have a project, it's going well, it develops trust, you have a rapport, and then funding goes away and it disappears and that resource is lost. So really, really love to think about that. Then the data-driven accountability, track your progress, gather your community feedback, look at your data. Is this actually having the impact that you're intending? Is that still the biggest need? Needs shift, right? I go back to our new first program. We started out doing software development, needs have shifted. And so, building into your programs, the ability to say, okay, well, this is what we needed to do initially, but things have changed and this is the next barrier, the next thing we have to address. Next page. Here's a few project spotlights on the digital equity side. These are from the West Virginia Office of Broadband, did a small pilot program as part of their initial Digital Equity Act planning grant that they got. And these were just a few we wanted to share. So one was the Bridgeport Public Library. Their project was they wanted to provide iPad mini tablets and some tech education for older adults. They did, tablet smartphone basics, how to use the internet safely, and had some like open technical assistance sessions. And they served over 60 individuals in the first 5 months. And one of the things they really wanted to share about their experience is the importance of building the trust with that population. They had to spend several months just getting seniors to trust them, to realize it was a useful thing, something maybe they wanted to do. So really thinking about, like, again, the trust building collaboration. So maybe if they did this again in the future, maybe there would be a organization that they could work through that might help speed that process up. So again, if you're thinking about doing something like this, is there an organization that already has that trust? Because those relationships are so key to folks actually taking advantage of services. And they were able to do this in a short amount of time, which is exciting, but definitely wanted to highlight that. Excuse me. Another one was the Upshur County Public Library. They did a project looking to expand mobile internet access to their residents. And they had 196 initial checkouts. They have had a lot of demand for these Wi-Fi hotspots and have had wait lists for them pretty much since. They're actually currently looking for additional funding to expand their hotspot lending programs even further. Some of the things that come out of this hotspots are an interesting, I've called kind of bridge solution on the deployment side, because again, you're not going to get the speeds, you're not going to be able to do everything you can do on a fixed or wired connection. But if you have nothing, it opens up the world. You can actually do quite a bit on a mobile hotspot if all you're used to is maybe slow DSL or no internet home at all. So they had some patrons actually get their own personal hotspots to use at home. But there are still obviously long-term service gaps. So this isn't going to solve that, but it can be a bridge technology to help folks in the meantime. All right. So you want to do this? What's next? Again, if you're in that planning, project planning, thinking about what could possibly happen, the first thing I like to tell folks is definitely think about like, what's your idea? Big picture. What do you want to do? Who do you want to help? Who do you think could do it? Just getting some of that down sometimes can be really helpful in terms of planning out your next steps and who to reach. I know a lot of folks that have a lot of really, really great ideas, but um, you kind of have to do that first step of getting something down so you can really start thinking about, all right, well, if this is what I want to do, who might the partners be? Who, already has some resources? Is somebody already working with these people? Are there any businesses we could work with? Because ultimately, before you're going to be ready to do any sort of grant or put together a project, you have to come up with that cost and budget. What are we paying for exactly? What are they doing? How much is it going to be? What is the bare minimum that you need to actually make your project run? What are the things that would make your project a lot smoother and a lot easier? Because until you have that, what your idea is, who your potential partners are, and some idea of cost and budget, it's going to be pretty tricky to scale that project and kind of move on to the next piece, which is your actual funding, grant development, funding development piece. Because the first thing anybody that you ask money from is they're going to ask for how much and what for. So you want to kind of start that project. And the other piece is get in touch. Like I said, we offer wraparound technical assistance for both deployment, digital equity, kind of any of those broadband access projects, and that can include everything from, grant writing just to, project development. So if you need to sit down and talk with someone about ways to put it together, if you're looking for specific subject expertise, I'm looking to develop a device distribution program. I don't know anybody that's done that. We can help make those connections, get you connected up with someone who has some experience and can offer some advice about what you might want to budget for in your cost and budget. So things like that. So please reach out. West Virginia Office of Broadband, always a great resource. They've developed a lot of good resources. WVU Grant Center offers free grant writing. Specifically, they also really good resource. And also, again, your local regional planning development councils get a lot of communications. They've been thinking about this for a long time. So also all good folks to reach out to kind of for the next step in developing a broadband access program. All right, and I think I'm going to hand this back over to Lucas.
All right, thank you so much, Annie. Moving forward, opening soon will be those state capacity subgrants that I talked about. Those will be opening up soon, hopefully. Also, the state broadband workforce grants will be opening up soon as well, we hope. We will keep you guys up to date on that, on information we get as we get it in. We did want to talk a little bit about terminology for a second. The term digital equity has been used for many years to describe the goal of creating the conditions where all residents have equal access to these online resources. While this term is still important and still describes our work, due to policies set forth by both state and federal administrations, you're likely to see these terms start to form in other terms, such as digital opportunity, digital or broadband adoption, bridging the digital divide, and many other terms just to adhere to state and federal regulations and executive orders. But the point we want to get with you guys is regardless of the words used, the need still remains. So whether it's equity, whether it's digital opportunity, whether it's bridging the digital divide, the need is still there. And so the work will still continue. It's still crucial that digital equity and broadband access initiatives continue to prioritize things like accessibility, affordability, and inclusivity for all. So here's some next steps. You could apply for our technical assistance for your broadband infrastructure and adoption projects. You can attend our next webinar session, which is Grant Hunting 101. It's about researching and finding the right opportunities for broadband and digital equity. We will have a guest speaker from the West Virginia Grant Resource Center with us, so that'll be an exciting opportunity to hear their perspective and what they offer. Another exciting news is the American Connection Corps, which hosts me, is looking for new host sites in West Virginia and is also looking for new members. So if that may be interest to you, please reach out to myself or reach out to Annie and we'll get that in contact for you. Applications are open, like Annie said earlier in the presentation, for our fellowship. So you could follow the QR code or you can apply online at Generation West Virginia. Application deadlines is March 16th. So yeah, if you know anybody who would like to be in our fellowship, please send them our way. We're looking for new people. Generation West Virginia is also hosting its first ever workforce conference, Pathways to Progress. It is going to be on May 8th in Charleston, West Virginia. You can follow the QR code there, or you can also go to generationwestvirginia.com and you can find information there as well. Early bird pricing is starting to dwindle away, so I would get it while you can, right, Annie? Is early bird still? Okay. And then finally on my little spiel, connect with us. So connect with us about our digital equity steering committees if you'd like to be a part of that. You could also subscribe to our newsletter, and there's the QR code for that. That'll keep you up to date on all things Generation West Virginia, but also all things that happen across the state as well. And there is my contact information, Annie's contact, Generation West Virginia's contact as well. And I think that's all on my end. So I think we're ready for questions or comments or concerns.
Don't see any questions in the chat. So last call on questions or comments, and I think we might be good to
Yeah,
wrap
if you
this
guys
one.
have any in the future, feel free to reach out to me or Annie and we'll be able to help you.
All right, well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you next month.